Thankful for your word, guidance, love, grace you give us. Thankful for this beautiful day. Thankful for the teachers that we have here and our elders. Pray, Lord, you be with us tonight. Help us to open our hearts and our minds to your word. Lay aside our daily worries and concentrate on your word that we might be better witnesses for you. Thanks for your blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, we ended last week in chapter 16, and what happened in chapter 16? Who rebelled? Korah rebelled, okay? And what were Moses and Aaron blamed for after Korah's rebellion? Death of whom? They were blamed for the death of Korah and the ground opening up. They were, so to speak, the heavies, okay? God's going to make it clear in chapter 17, we'll read in just a few minutes, that he was responsible for that. It really wasn't Moses and Aaron, and we all recognize that. And anybody with a modicum of intelligence would understand that Moses and Aaron didn't open up the ground, that it was a significant miracle. So we get into chapter 17, and chapter 17 is about what? I'm sorry?
Aaron's staff.
Aaron's staff, okay, Aaron's staff. So let's look at, at least the first 7 verses. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel. Okay, and the reason he wants Moses to speak to the sons of Israel is because the sons of Israel are grumbling about the miracle that was performed and the significance of it. And if you keep in mind, remember after Korah's rebellion and the ground opened up, what was the response of the people? They were grumbling about who? Moses and Aaron and indirectly God, okay? And what does God send on to give to them? That kills 14,700 of them? A plague, okay? When God sends a plague, it's not a plague that it's not like the coronavirus and you're going to get a little sick, okay? It kills you. And that's what he did, okay? And so I know Moses and Aaron were taking all kinds of flack, and indirectly God was too, and he's going to comment on that in just a moment. So in verse 17, he says, then the complaint was about Moses and Aaron was what? What were they perceived to be doing?
Taking too much responsibility.
Taking too much responsibility, okay? Because one of the complaints was, hey, all of us are God's children. All of us are the children of Israel. God listens to all of us. God talks to all of us. Was that true? Yes, kinda, okay? That's a perfect answer. Thank you very much. Well, he even listens to the ones that are disobedient, doesn't he? I sure hope so.
But he does do what they want.
Yes, okay. So that's where we are. God, if you think about it, it's extremely easy for a human to understand. Had I been in God's position and dealing with these people, I would have been totally frustrated. If it had been humans dealing with Israel, what would have happened to Israel? I'm convinced they would have been destroyed. I'm convinced. The only thing that prevented God from destroying them was the love that he had for his creation. I'm convinced of that. And so we get into chapter 17, and God gives these directions to Moses. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, and get from them a rod from each father's household, 12 rods from all their leaders, according to their households. And when you see households, put in the word tribes. You shall write each name on his rod, and write Aaron's name on the rod of Levi, for there is one rod for the head of each of their father's households. So when they're talking about the father's households, they're talking about the tribes, each individual tribe. Deposit them in the tent of meeting. in the tent of meeting in front of the testimony. You know, I always thought that they went into the testimony, but they didn't. They were outside of it, apparently. Where I meet with you, and this is the reason why, it will come about that the rod of the man whom I choose will sprout. Who was God choosing? He was choosing a leader, wasn't he? Was that he was going to point out to all of Israel who the leader of his choice was. Okay? Thus I will lessen from upon myself the grumblings of the sons of Israel who are grumbling against me. Who are they supposed to grumble about once this person has been chosen? They're supposed to grumble about him instead of grumbling about God. Okay? Verse 6, Moses therefore spoke to the sons of Israel and did as God requested. He deposited the rods, verse 7, before the Lord in the tent of testimony. The result of this demonstration and its meaning in verses 8 through 10. Now on the next day Moses went into the tent of testimony, and behold, the rod of Aaron for the house of Levi had sprouted, put forth buds, and produced blossoms. It bore ripe almonds. What's the probability that's going to happen? Somewhere between slim and by none by any natural means, okay? God once again performs a miracle. Moses then brought out all the rods from the presence of the Lord to all the sons of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. How many rods budded? One, okay? Because that's who God wanted to be the leader, okay? Put back the rod of Aaron before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels. I guess that's where I got the idea that it was in the testimony, because it was later on in there. Now, how does the congregation respond to this sign? Well, look at verses 12 and 13. The sons of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, behold, we perish, we are dying, we are all dying. Is that not true about all of us? I think they were more specific. Everyone who comes near to what? Okay, the tent of meeting. Yeah, if you come near the tent of meeting, okay, odds are you're going to die. Who comes near to the tabernacle of the Lord must die. Are we to perish completely? You know, it seems to me that the response of the congregation is basically emotional, and it's not well reasoned. I know none of us have ever been in a position under what today we call stress, and we made decisions based on emotion rather than reasoning, right? If any of you raise your hand, I'm going to come down there and slap it, okay? We all do that, don't we? Don't we make decisions based on emotion rather than reason? You know, how typically human. Two emotions seem to prevail. One, an exaggerated concern or fear, probably because of Jehovah's most recent behavior with Korah and the plague. A lot of people were killed, okay? And they feared God. They feared God for the physical things that he could do to them. Two, simply sour grapes of jealousy related to God making the tribe of Levi a priesthood. Now, there could be others, and maybe that doesn't strike you, but those are the two that really struck me. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that? Don't everybody speak up at once.
Question on back in verse 1 and 5, where they took the rod of Levi's, and that's who Aaron put his name on that staff. I think that's kind of interesting.
Well, all of them had their names on them.
Yeah, I know.
And why would they have their names on them? Why sometimes at work, okay, or maybe someplace else, do you wear a name tag? So people will know who you are, even though they've seen you all their life. It's just the way we are. Okay, so it may have been something else besides fear and jealousy, but those are two such basic human emotions, it seems to me. Go ahead, Jim. Oh, absolutely. Well, who? It seems to me they were in fear of who, more so of whom than than Jesus. Is that what you said, Jesus? Well, they may have been, if they were going to kill Moses, they might have done it a whole lot sooner. I mean, it's just one of those things. If you know, somebody that threatens you, but who, as much as they may fear God, what's the chance that they're going to make an accusation against Jehovah? In so many words, Jehovah, it's your fault that Korah died. Okay, it's your fault that the plague killed 14,700. Anybody here got enough guts to do that? I don't think so either. Okay, so you pick on the handiest thing around, and that happened to be Moses and Aaron. And it's still going to be that way. It's not going to change. It's still going to be that way. So we see this, you know, again, human emotion. And then in verse 18, excuse me, chapter 18, not verse 18, chapter 18, we see once again the recitation of the primary responsibilities of the priesthood. In verse 1, so the Lord said to Aaron, you and your sons and your father's household with you shall bear the guilt in connection with the sanctuary, and you and your sons with you shall bear the guilt in connection with your priesthood. What does it mean? Responsibility, okay? Yeah, put responsibility instead of guilt. Responsibility in what sense? Who could they allow in the tabernacle? You'll have to speak up just a little, please. Levites, they were the only ones, okay? Nobody except the Levites could come into the tabernacle. And if you approached the tabernacle, if you violated the tabernacle, what happened to you? You died. You were stoned. Okay, that's...
How do you know they died by stone?
Because there's a verse that I did not write down that says that's how they died. They died by stoning. I'll find it for you. Let me make a note here. Stoning. Yeah, stoning back then meant something different than it means today. You know, if you get stoned today, what does that mean? You get drunk. Yeah, that's not. I will find that for you. So they were responsible not only for the tabernacle, but they were responsible for the priesthood too. And that means doing what? Okay, making the sacrifices, keeping the priesthood. What's that four-letter word starts with H?
Holy.
Holy. Thank you. Holy, keeping it holy. And that means what? Separated where? To God. That's what he's talking about, okay? And that was their responsibility. Their responsibility was not only the tabernacle and later on the temple to keep it holy, but it was to keep the priesthood holy too. Because God said what?
I'm holy and you shall be holy.
Be ye holy, for I am holy. I'm sure glad it's not that way today, right? And if you think that, we need to have a long discussion after the lesson today, because it's exactly the same. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that many Christians have today. Not just those out in the world, but being holy. Separating ourselves to God. I mean, we've all been in positions where, unfortunately, we've made decisions which we knew up front were not the right decision to make. We chose to sin. God says that's not good. Be ye holy, for I am holy. If we want to approach God, we have to be holy. There's just absolutely no question about it. Then Aaron warns, we're in chapter 18 now. Then God warns Aaron that even the other Levites must be careful serving Aaron at the tabernacle. What was one of the things, which of the Levitical tribes carried the altar and carried the no, only one.
Oh, I thought it was two.
There was only one that carried everything that was made of gold and silver that was in the Holy of Holies. And
Yeah, they got no carts.
absolutely, that's exactly it. Because the one that got the carts, they carried all of the tent, all of the wooden framework for it. They needed it, but not that carrying the. Isn't that terrible? Not that carrying the lampstand or carrying the laver and the other things. Not that they weren't heavy also, but they had to be carried on the shoulder. It was the Kohathites, okay? Kohathites. The guys that carried all the wood and drapery and all of that kind of thing were the Merarites and the Gershonites. And the only reason I remember that is because I'm teaching this lesson today. And then in verses 8 through 32, and we're going to skip most of it. But what he says in verse 8, then the Lord spoke to Aaron, now behold, I myself have given you charge of my offerings. When he says my offerings, what's he talking about? The offerings that people bring to him. The sacrifices that made. The Levitical priesthood didn't have a farm, okay? They didn't have animals that they raised in order to feed themselves. Where did they get their food from? How did he give it to them? Because God gave them his offerings, okay? Everything that the children of Israel offered to God became whose? The Levites. The Levites got it. It took me a long time to figure that out because I was going through and saying, let me see, now this offering, they got this portion of it. Maybe they didn't get all of it, but they got basically a portion of everything. They got the first fruits. They got the best of everything. Why? Because that's what Israel gave to God, or at least, that's what they were supposed to give to God, okay? Any different today for us? That what we give to God has to be the best, not just the hand-me-downs? In verse 11, the end of the verse there, he says, every one of your household who is clean may eat of it. It's a perpetual allotment. In other words, for the time that the Levites were the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, the time that they were that, all of those generations, Israel fed them. That's how they lived. Verse 15, every first issue of the womb of all flesh belongs to whom? Belongs to whom? God. Who did God give it to? He gave it to the Levites. Okay? And what did they do? They helped the Levites serve. He goes on to talk about the firstborn of an ox and how that was dealt with, or a sheep. And then in verse 19, all the offerings of the holy gifts. What were the holy gifts? What was the difference between a holy gift and a sacrifice, a bullock or a sheep or a goat sacrificed?
Atonement versus command.
Yes.
The children was for the firstborn was to atone for the.
Yes, that's true. But the main thing here is this idea of command. They gave the sheep and the goats and they sacrificed them because that was God's command. But the gifts were a free will offering. That was what the Israelites decided, I will give this to God. Why? Because God's demonstrated his love for me, and I love God, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to give something to God. Can you see how this rolled into our beloved Savior Jesus Christ and how it fits into his law? It's the same thing. It's the beginning of this. You know, you look back at the old law and you talk to some people and they say, oh, this, you know, there wasn't any love in the old law and there wasn't any spirit in the old law. And I don't know what book those people are reading from, but they're not reading from the same book that I'm reading from that has the word Bible on the front of it. You know, the bottom line, everything that exists in Jesus Christ today existed under the old law. It was just disguised. When Paul talks about the fact in Ephesians that you can understand the mystery that he came to understand, how can we understand it? We have to read it. Isn't that strange? If you want to know what, bless you, if you want to know what Paul understands about the mystery of God, then read what he wrote about it. Why do you think God wants us to study? So that we can know the mystery of God, and we get to spend eternity where if we do? We get to spend eternity in heaven with all the righteous, with Jesus Christ our Savior, with Jehovah God, the creator of the universe. Isn't that fantastic? That's what's available to us. All we have to do is pay attention and do as we've been directed. Now there is the challenge for every one of us. Verse 20 really gives us the why the Lord did this. Then the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land. Whose land? Who's it there? T-H-E-I-R? Israel. Thank you, Nancy. It's Israel that he's talking about. You shall have no inheritance in their land, that is the land of Canaan, the land of promise, nor own any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the sons of Israel. Verse 21, to the sons of Israel, behold, I have given all of the tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service, which they perform, the service of the tent of meeting. The sons of Israel shall not come near the tent of meeting again, or they will bear sin and die. Only the Levites shall perform the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a personal statute, or perpetual, statute throughout your generation, and among the sons of Israel, they shall have no inheritance. Why do the Levites have no inheritance? Actually, they did have an inheritance. What was their inheritance? It was God. God was their inheritance. Okay, serving God was their inheritance. Who has that inheritance today? We do. We do. I hope it impresses you more now than perhaps a statement like that did before. It is critically important that we recognize we have an inheritance from God. It is Jehovah himself. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, just connected to the writings of Paul and Hebrews in regards to what that means when we're called priests. It's more than what the world looks at. The power that's involved with that is just stark.
I think it's more than we understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I think it's more than the Jews certainly didn't understand it, and they had a similar situation. No? Interesting in verse 24. Where did the Levites get the things that they offered to Jehovah? The gifts that they offered to Jehovah. Absolutely. Other tribes gave it to him. Verse 24, for the tithe of the sons of Israel, which they offer as an offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I have said concerning him, they shall have no inheritance among the sons of Israel. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, moreover, you shall speak to the Levites and say to them, when you take from the sons of Israel the tithe which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present an offering from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. So the income, if for want of a better term, of the tribe of Levi was what the other tribes gave them, and the other tribes tithed to God. And who else had to tithe to God? Tithe to God? The Levites. Okay? Everybody that loved God gave to God. Some of the things God commanded specifically and gave great detail on what it was to look like. And other times it was a free will offering that God said, if you love me, you'll do what? Besides keep my commandments. You'll give. You'll support me. You'll support, do what's necessary in order to keep it going. Then we get to an interesting chapter. And I thought I was going to get farther. Sorry, Kent. I was hoping I'd get further anyway. Chapter 19 is the chapter on the red heifer and cleansing water, okay? And I'm not going to read a whole lot of this because this specific procedure has no applicability today other than to get the message that God wants us to get, that it's important you follow my direction. So, verse 1 says, then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, this is chapter 19, saying, verse 2, this is the statute of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, speak to the sons of Israel that they bring you an unblemished red heifer in which is no defect and on which a yoke has never been placed. Okay. And then verses 3 through 5 talk about the preparation of the red heifer. Okay. And you get down to verse 6. It's interesting. The priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet material and cast it into the midst of the burning heifer. The heifer is being sacrificed and these things are thrown in there and they get all mixed up and they become part of the ashes. And then the ashes ultimately are mixed with water. And what was this water used for? Purification, for cleansing. Okay, now I have a question for you. How do the 4 ingredients taken from these ashes, when added to water, cleanse? That is spot on. Spot on. The bottom line is that without the 6th and final ingredient to the mixture, there is no cleansing. What's the 6th ingredient? I'm sorry?
Following God.
Following God. Actually, it's more than just following God. It's the power of God that is the 6th ingredient. It makes it happen. How does being dipped down in water, okay, cleanse you of your sins? Because God says so. And we see the same thing happening underneath the old law. It wasn't, this particular baptism wasn't water. It was this mixture that was made, okay, only by the addition of the 6th and final ingredient, the power of Jehovah, is there any cleansing at all. There was none before that. 7 and 8 talk about purification of the priest. The mixture will be used to make water for impurity. That term is used in verse 9 and several other verses. And used to cleanse from uncleanness. When they're talking about uncleanness in this context, what are they talking about? I'm sorry, I heard somebody say it. Sin. They're talking about cleansing from sin. They're not talking about cleansing the physical body, okay? This mixture is not going to cleanse the physical body. But when God performs a miracle, okay, and cleanses you spiritually from sin, okay, that works. And that's what we're talking about. And it's the same thing that we do when we're baptized into Jesus Christ. It's the exact same thing. Well, maybe not exactly the same, but this foreshadowed what was coming. And then he gives us in verses 7 through 22 in chapter 19 some various examples of uncleanness. In verses 7 and 8, talks about the priests when they're unclean, what they have to do to wash their clothes and bathe their body in water. Okay, did this particular mixture clean their clothes in the way we think of cleaning our clothes? No. It cleansed them from sin, okay? Verse 10, it talks about the person that gathers the ashes from this procedure that they've just gone through. That person is unclean and has to be cleansed, okay? Verse 14 talks about a man who dies in a tent, okay? Everyone who comes into the tent and everyone who is in the tent, guess what? They're unclean. Okay, why are they unclean? Yes, because God said they were unclean. Okay, to be perfectly candid with you, who am I to argue with God? Verse 16, anyone who touches anybody that has died out in the field, human bone or a grave, you're unclean for 7 days. Verse 16. The ones who burns it, that is, who burns this red heifer, that person is unclean. Furthermore, verse 22, anything that the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and the person who touches it shall be unclean until evening. Verse 22 is sort of a catch-all. Basically, if you have been around someone or something that is unclean, then guess what? You're unclean. Okay? So if you're unclean, generally, you're unclean until evening, and then you cleanse yourself with this water of purity, and you can do anything any other Jew can do. But until you have gotten rid of the uncleanness, you're cut off from God. Why? What did God say? Be ye holy, for I am holy. Okay, I can't stress how critically important it is for us today. And when I say for us, I'm pointing at least four of my fingers at me, to understand that concept. Because I know I haven't in the past. Be ye holy, for I am holy. You know, I've got to believe, if I truly understand it, okay, it's going to make living righteously so much easier. If I'm holy as God is holy, does that mean I'll never be tempted? No. Does it mean I will never give in and sin? No. But I'll tell you, it's going to help me on that road. There's no question in my mind about that. And then verses 17 through 19, we see the procedure for application of the water impurity. I'm not going to read that. And in verses 20 and 21, I am going to read, because there was a penalty for non-purification. If you had committed a sin and you weren't purified, okay, but the man who is unclean and does not purify himself from uncleanness, that person shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly, because he has defied the sanctuary of the Lord. When you defile the sanctuary of the Lord, what are you doing? Who are you defiling? You're defiling God, okay? The water for impurity has not been sprinkled on him. He is unclean, so it shall be a perpetual statute for them. We see in chapter 20 that they remain at Kadesh. You remember where Kadesh is? It's on the west side of the Jordan. They haven't got over to Moab yet. And then we see who died in verse 1. Miriam dies, okay? Now Miriam died there and was buried there. In chapter 20, verses 2 through 13, or I can get through this good. I want us to think about this as some background, because what we're going to, whose sin are we going to look at in chapter 20? Moses' sin. Okay, Moses' sin. As we're all aware, there's a very arid, this is a very arid region, and in the 16 to 17 months that Israel has been traveling, lack of water has been one of the main things that they grumbled about and complained about. And we see here where they're camped, verse 2, there was no water for the congregation. We have also seen that Moses, like Jehovah himself, is very frustrated with the attitude of the people of Israel, including the fact that for Israel, he and Aaron tend to be the target of convenience for their complaints. Only a complete fool makes Jehovah the named target. I've got to believe that's one where you get the bolt of lightning to come out of the sky and crisp you if you complain about Jehovah. Here we go again in verse 2. And they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. What had just happened? How many Israelites have to die before Israel gets the message? Hey, pay attention to what God says. Don't grumble, don't complain, okay? The people thus contended with Moses and spoke, verse 3, if only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. What brothers must they be talking about? No. Yeah, the guys just died. Korah and his followers, okay? All of the ones that died in that plague. It seems to me that's who they have to be talking about. Same whining as before about the pleasures of Egypt. Their memory of Egypt is very limited and selective. I'm just glad I'm not that way, that I can always keep my memory so broad. I don't want any of you to go talk to my wife about my memory, okay? I will be truly embarrassed. No, I'm just kidding. You can talk to her about it. I have terrible memory. Even though Oliver thinks I have a good memory, I really have a lousy one, okay? I forget things regularly. But, you know, the bottom line is, you know, verse 5, why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. They also invoke here in verse 6, then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly through the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink. Okay? Does Moses follow God's command? Kinda, okay? Sorta, okay? What's the probability you're going to spend eternity with God if you kinda listen to what he says or sorta listen to what he says? 0. Not going to happen. And Moses found out that, okay? And in Moses' case, what appearing at that point in time was he focused on rather than on heaven? Going where? Into Canaan, into the land of milk and honey, that God had promised. That's where he wanted to go. That's what this 40 years wandering around in the wilderness, okay? Even though God talked to him. I mean, he had incredible privileges that none of the rest of the Israelites had. Kevin, go ahead.
Oh, you got 5 minutes.
Oh, I got 5 minutes. Oh, you're good to me. Okay, good. Maybe I can get done with, well, I can get most of it done anyway. I can get us to the plains of Moab. How's that? So Moses and Aaron humble themselves, and Jehovah speaks to Moses, and that's in verse 8. Take the rod and your brother, assemble the congregation, speak to the rock before their eyes. He tells them what to do. So in verse 9, so Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the ark, and he said to them, listen now, you rebels. Isn't that interesting that one rebel would be calling the rest of them rebels? Shall we bring forth, shall what? Shall we, who do you suppose that we was? Yeah, probably him and Aaron was who he had reference to. He probably did not have reference to Jehovah. Where am I? So with the rock. So we bring forth water for you out of the rock. Then Moses lifted up his hand, struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beast strength. What does that demonstrate about God? What was the complaint of Israel at this point in time? No water. So what did God give them? He provided water. Why? Because he loved them. If we don't learn anything else about it, God puts up with us just as he puts up with Israel because he loves us. I don't know about you, but I look in the mirror sometimes and I think, why in the world does God love me? I'm a sinner. But he loves me. He sent his son to save me. Wow. How incredible. How incredible. And then we see in chapter 12, or excuse me, verse 12 of chapter 20. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy, to do what? Treat me as holy, hallowed, some translations use. Okay, in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Verse 13, those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. And next week we will finish chapter 20 and hopefully get further along than I did this week.
I got a question. What did they do for water before that time?
What did they do?
Obviously, they've been getting water somehow. So why did they,
Let me see. You're welcome to look in any journal that you would like, written back in this time period, okay? But I think this is the only one you're going to find. And if it's not in here, okay? And to answer your question, I don't have a clue.
yeah, but they had the water up till then, you think, you know?
Oh, I don't think. I know they did. Okay, at least a certain amount of it, but they didn't have as much as they wanted, and they didn't have the food that they wanted. Okay? Was there no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think it's interesting that this is the first time we see where God tells Moses and Aaron that they're not going to go into the land of Israel. But back when the spies came out, at that time, he said the only ones going in would be Joshua and Caleb. So it's sort of a, you wonder if they realized at that time that they would be going in for some reason, or if God just knew they would be going in. Because God says there's only two of the Lord and Joshua and Caleb, and yet there's no mention of Moses and Aaron not getting going until this time.
Well, you know, one of the things that are interesting, what tribe were Moses and Aaron from? Which made them, it made them priests. Okay? Now when God counted off, and he's going to count them off again in just Maybe next week, but probably not, probably the week after. I'm on next week, right? I'm on the 1st, okay. Eric's going to be here on the 8th and do his next piece on Israel. Anyway, it's interesting. The more I study this, the more I really get the impression, or excuse me, I get some confusion about what was God's position relative to the 22,723. Was that the number? Anybody remember it? Levites that were counted, that were 1 month and older, relative to going into the land. I'm not sure. You know, and I've looked at it a couple of different times. So that's an interesting question. I'd like you guys to study it more and come up with an answer next week, okay? Book, chapter, and verse, please. Kevin, go ahead.
Read Deuteronomy.
What?
Will we give
Oh, I'm sorry.
something in Deuteronomy?
I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that.
So that'll,
Kevin will have the answer for us when he teaches Deuteronomy.
you will see the answer there in Deuteronomy.
Teach you to raise your hand, see?
I'll raise my hand. Deuteronomy.
Okay, so the answer apparently is in Deuteronomy, because I don't know.
The whole thing.
All of Deuteronomy? Next week we'll try and get through 4 or 5 more chapters. And then Eric will be here the week after that, and we'll be talking about modern day Israel with some reference back. Come on in. Don't be bashful. You guys aren't bashful anyway. Come on, get in here and sit down. And then I will finish up with Numbers, hopefully a little more speedily. And then Kevin will have Deuteronomy. That is the plan, correct? For Wednesday night. Okay.